By the time Eli Mercer saw the boy, the light was the color of tin, and the wind had gone mean. It came scudding across the open like a hungry thing, raising lacework dust from the crusted snow and teasing the sage in little shivers. It was the kind of late afternoon in the high country when a man's thoughts started to climb into his collar. What had he done? Who would miss him if the cold took him? How far the nearest stove might be? Eli had been walking 2 days with more silence than bread, his bedroll greased by months of road grime and the soles on his boots scalloped thin. He had no one waiting, and he was in no hurried way to anywhere particular, which is the same as saying he was a drifter, though he never used that word on himself. He would have said, if anyone asked, that he was between outfits or following the weather, but nobody asked, and that was fine. The cottonwoods along the creek showed up before the creek itself, black ribs against the winter sky. From distance, he thought he'd spotted deer kicked down into the bottoms, maybe a rabbit if he was lucky. As he got closer, he realized the shape wasn't an animal at all, but a small person, huddled on the lee side of a fallen trunk, too still for comfort. He had learned in the war and after to read stillness. This wasn't the stillness of sleep, more the way a body goes quiet to save itself. "Hi there," Eli called, letting his voice out easy like talking to a skittish colt. The figure didn't move. He set his bedroll down and put both hands up where they could be seen, as if some invisible lawman had him at gunpoint. He stepped around the trunk. The boy lifted his face. Wind had sanded his cheeks raw. His eyes were big and dark, not with fear so much as hollowed-out hunger, and the bit of hair at the front had frozen into little salt-white points. He was wrapped in something fur-lined that had leaked out its stuffing long ago. There was a strip of leather at his throat, and hanging from it a disc of shell worn thin by fingers, the color of old ivory, carved with 4 lines at the edges like crude rays. Eli squatted. He was used to measuring problems, as a stable hand, as a private in a Missouri regiment, as a track layer after the war. What he measured now was whether he had enough to share, and whether that was even a question a man was allowed to ask, seeing a child. "Cold," the boy said, the word careful, like he'd borrowed it. "Colder if you stay," Eli replied. He tugged his glove off with his teeth and slid it onto the boy's hand, then the other glove. "You got folks?" He swept a glance around the cottonwoods, the torn reeds, the creek frozen into plates and ribbons, listening for the prickle of other breath in the brush. A winter crow complained farther down. The boy pointed downstream, then brought his hand to his belly. The gesture didn't need translation. "Hungry," Eli said, answering the belly, not the boy, because his own had been speaking the same word for half the day. He shrugged off his pack and found the last of his jerky, stiff as a stick, and a heel of bread he'd put off, finishing on purpose, in case he ended up like this. When there's only one bite left, you hold it like a spell. He broke it and let the boy choose the larger half. He also untied the little cloth packet of coffee and, with the ceremony of a communion, slipped a pinch directly onto the boy's tongue. The child blinked. The bitter woke his mouth, and he laughed once. A hiccup of real sound. "There's a cabin another mile up if the creek is telling the truth," Eli said. He'd heard about it in the last settlement from a trapper named Fenn, who was wintering farther east. Fenn had said, "I leave a coffee tin on the shelf for the road poor. Put some in if you take some out." Eli had been counting on that tin the way a man counts on some unprovable bit of good in the world. "We'll get a fire." The boy stood up slowly. He was smaller than Eli expected after hearing the laugh. 8, maybe 9. He wore moccasins so worn, the front left toe showed daylight, and his breath feathered at the corners of his mouth. He watched Eli's hands as if they were a language. "My name's Eli," he tried. "Ely." He tapped his chest. The boy considered, then tapped his own chest. "Tane," he said. He said it 2 ways, the second softer, like the first syllable was a step into a stream. "Tane," Eli repeated. The name sat in his mouth like a pebble, strange and right. "Let's get you warm, Tane." They followed the creek as it kinked and flattened, skirting drifts that looked shallow and weren't, crossing where the ice wore a skin of snow seeded with grass. The cottonwoods told him where the bank would ease. The rabbit tracks told him what the fox was thinking. The wind told him this would not be a good night to be lost. He stayed a pace ahead and a little to the side, never directly between the boy and whatever he might have been watching for behind them. In the back of his mind crawled the knowledge that people were not rabbits. A hungry child did not get lost this far from company without reason. The cabin showed itself as a darker angle against the dusk, a slouch of roof with a stovepipe angled like an old man's finger. It stood in a tuck of willows with its door facing east, away from the worst of the weather, and the snow piled against the north side like a banked wave. Eli pushed the door, and it gave reluctantly, the wood having swelled with what little sun there was and congealed when the cold returned. Inside, a table even older than the light, 2 chairs, a shelf, a narrow bunk with a ticking stuffed with pine needles, an iron stove with its mouth open like it had died mid-breath. Eli put his hands on his knees and thought, "Thank you, Fen." On the shelf, in among a box of dull nails and a saucer with 3 buttons, he found the tin. It had something in it. He shook and heard dry rattle. "Saints alive," he said, only half joking. And then he was moving, laying kindling, coaxing flame, feeding slivers of split wood until the stove's thin walls turned shy rosy. The boy stood as close as he dared, his face leaning toward the heat like a plant toward a window. Eli set the coffee pot to boil, this time proper, not just a pinch for courage. He found beans in a sack on the back of the shelf and added a handful to the old grounds, as if the ghosts of previous cups could bring their memory to help the new. He broke the last of the jerky into the pot as it simmered. Cowboy soup, his regiment had called it when rattling across Arkansas. Stretch your food with water and story. "Here," he said, handing the boy the first tin cup, then another to himself. Tane drank with 2 hands, eyes closed on the heat. When he opened them, he looked around the little room as if it had not existed before he swallowed. He pointed to the shell at his neck. "Mother," he said, touching the disc. Then he touched the window and the night beyond it. He frowned and set his mouth the way small boys do when they're staying brave. The word he said next was not English. Eli recognized none of it, but he recognized what it carried. He nodded. "We'll keep a fire," he said. "We'll keep a fire all night." But they ate what there was, and Eli spread his bedroll and the extra blanket in a sandwich on the bunk, needles or no, it would beat the floor, and showed Tane how to climb in facing the wall, so the draft from the door wouldn't find him. He took the chair nearest the stove himself, put his boots under it to dry, and laid his rifle across his knees, not as a threat, but as a piece of wood that had a duty. He took the oil rag from the shelf and ran it along the barrel with the same care as he'd used on the boy's hands. Outside, the wind ran its fingers down the cabin boards and made a sound like a faraway someone singing at the bottom of a bottle. Eli thought of nights after the war when a dozen men had snored in a single car, the iron wheels telling the rails their facts. He thought of a woman in St. Joseph who'd kept a boarding house and told him, in the voice of someone putting down a pin, that sad men were heavier than furniture. He thought of himself at 14, pushing a mule up a muddy Missouri road, his father drunk somewhere behind and his mother quiet on a quilt. He did not think of God. That habit had silted up somewhere between Shiloh and a burned-out farm in Cass County, and he had not yet found a reason to dredge it clear. He slept or didn't, slipping in and out, the way a man does when he knows he's the only sentry in a fort of 2. Once, near midnight, his head nodded, and he dreamed he was back on picket, the prairie unharmed by fences, the sky full of light the color of copper. He woke with his neck hurting, and the stove making a little tinny ticking as it settled, the fire still good. At dawn, the snow took a breath. That is the only way to describe it. The air shook very slightly, as if a blanket had been thrown up and was in the middle of falling again. Eli went to the door and lifted the latch, and then he saw them, first as shadows on the lighter shadow of the ridge, horses and riders beaded along the top like a border stitched by an unhurried hand. They were not a few, they were not a dozen. They were, by his old soldier's measure, the size of a regiment, maybe more. One line, then another, then a scatter through the cottonwoods like dark seeds. 200. More. He did not count like a census taker. He counted like a man who knows what numbers can do to your breathing. He closed the door softly and let the latch settle into its notch. He set his hand on the stove because he needed heat. Behind him, he felt the small shift on the bunk as Tane sat up, eyes bigger now, not with hunger, but with that mixture of relief and worry that visits even very young people when their people appear. The boy listened, and in his listening, there was a softening. He looked at Eli. "Home," Tane said, and touched the shell at his throat. For a brief, foolish second, Eli felt offended that the boy could call something else home after one night and a soup made of his last things. Then he recognized the thought as what it was, and let it pass like a bad smell through a room. "You tell me what to do," he said, "because asking is a kind of bravery too." Tane slid off the bunk and came to the door, his toes curled on the cold floor. He held up his hand like a man would to halt a wagon, then turned his palm and lowered it, slow. "Wait." He moved his hands as if smoothing the air. "Easy." He pointed to the chair, meaning Eli should sit. He meant to talk first. He meant to let them come. The wind fell enough that Eli could hear horses breathing, could hear the winter hinge squeak of leather, and a voice here and there, not loud, a voice speaking to a horse, to another rider, to the day. He saw, plain as the stove and the boy and his own hands, that the world had walked up to his door with its hat on and its heart guarded, and what he did now would matter for longer than the morning. He set the rifle back up on its pegs and took the coffee pot from the stove and poured 2 cups. He set one by the bunk for the boy and took the other in his hand, and he opened the door and stepped out into the cold with the steam lifting from the cup like a white flag. "Morning," he said to the ridge and the riders, to the snow and his own fear. "This is your boy." The light did not get warmer exactly, but it changed. It slid over the horses until their coats looked oiled and their breath made little banners. The nearest riders began to pick their way down off the ridge, slow, in 2s and 3s. Eli stood so they could see both of his hands, one holding a tin cup and the other empty. The boy took 2 steps and, without hesitation, walked out past Eli's knee into the open, his face turned upward, the way a plant turns toward a window. They did not come as a charge. That was the first mercy. They came as men and women come down a poor slope in winter, with their bodies thinking for their horses, short reins, voices low. Eli saw, as they grew larger, that this was not a line of war only. There were painted shields and clean bows, yes, and rifles slung with care. There were kid ponies with the slouch of children, and 2 older women in beaded leggings who rode like they had been born sitting and never learned to fall. There were boys with hair in 2 braids, and women with hair in 3, and a man whose face was a map of creases that had nothing to do with pity. There were hunters, there were uncles, there were cousins. It was not a party, it was a people. That was the second mercy. Tane took 3 steps and then 3 more, then ran the last 5 yards, as if he had measured just how far he needed to be brave before he could be a child. A man in a calico shirt swung down and caught him, not hard, and held him at arm's length to look into his face. The man's hair was bound with rawhide, and the lower part of his left ear had been nicked by something or someone long ago. He spoke to the boy in words that were too quick for Eli, words with the soft N Eli had heard in Tane, and the boy answered in a tumble. The man's face did a beautiful thing. He did not smile. He allowed the smile to happen to him. The older of the 2 women reached over and touched Tane's cheek, like she was checking a kettle for heat, then made a brief sign with her hand over his head, down his shoulders, across his chest. Some way of saying the world could go on now. The man looked up to the cabin and at Eli, and in that one glance Eli could feel the measurement the other was making, where the hands had been, whether the fire had been kind enough, whether there was anything around the mouth that would tell the truth, if the words did not. The man lifted his palm in a general gesture of greeting, bent, and kissed the top of the boy's head with no self-consciousness at all. He said something that sounded like a name. Tane said Eli and turned, and that was how the man learned it. Another rider came in on an angle, a big-chested Appaloosa under him with winter fur up. He wore an army greatcoat, the blue faded into some color between question and answer, and his hat had a beaded band bright enough to be a sunrise if a sunrise could be tied. Eli recognized that kind of coat, not by the cut, but by the way a man moves when wool has taught him not to want. The rider raised his hand, not with the hard upthrust gesture of a warning, but flat, showing his palm the way you show somebody you've got no fishhooks. He spoke English in a voice lined with gravel. "He came to your house," the man said, nodding toward Tane, and then included the whole line of people with a glance as efficient as a blade. He went out for rabbit and the snow made a different plan. He looked at the boy again, and his mouth did that allowing smile. "Little fool," he said in English with more love than scold. He touched his fist lightly against his own breastbone. "Grey Hawk," he said, identifying himself. "This is my sister's son." Eli lowered his head a fraction, the movement an apology and a hello. "Eli Mercer." Grey Hawk's eyes took him in, and like any man not interested in lies, moved quickly on. "We waited," he said simply, and indicated with a tilt of his brow the long ridge that was still shedding riders like seeds. "Too many horses near the house all at once. Your people get stupid." He made a shape with his hand, of a thing that bumps into itself when there is plenty of room not to. "We do not like to step on a house." "I'm obliged you didn't," Eli said. "I kept a fire." He heard the foolishness in the second sentence when it was already in the air. Grey Hawk did not laugh at him for it. One of the older women slid off her horse with the boneless grace of someone who could have slept in a saddle her whole life and never had a crick. She approached Eli with her chin up and eyes direct, and held out a bundle wrapped in a brown blanket piece. He reached as if it were a baby, which pleased her. He could see the flicker of approval on her face. Inside, dried meat cut thin, a ball of parched corn, 2 small loaves made in a pan that had seen better seasons, and a little crock sealed with beeswax. "We bring back what you gave," she said, or rather, she said a string of syllables and looked at Grey Hawk until he nodded a translation. "And more." Eli put his hand over his heart and then over the bundle and stepped aside to clear space on the table by the door. He caught Tane's eyes and saw there, not hero worship, not fealty, just the simple joy of someone who has had his life doubled overnight. Family, plus this new strange helper who might be ridiculous, but who made hot coffee and did not flinch. From the lower meadow came the jangle and creak of another group. Eli turned, his scalp going cold under his hat. 4 men in sheepskin coats and mismatched hats were clattering along the creek on cow ponies, the local variety of neighborliness, all watch and no patience. They hauled up 6 lengths shy of the first line of riders. The one in front, Galvin, a rancher with a voice like a file and a reputation for breaking colts too young, stood in his stirrups and slung his arm wide. "Hell's this?" he said. "Parade?" Grey Hawk did not move. The line did not move. The horses moved a little, because horses are a language. "Morning, Tom," Eli called out, and wished his voice hadn't carried something that sounded like a plea. "Boy wandered. Found him in the willows last night. They're taking him home." "That's so." Galvin wheeled his horse to face him square. "They need the whole damn chapter of the tribe for one child?" "It's their child," Eli said. "They get to write the chapter." Galvin snorted. "You ain't the sheriff." He eyed the line the way a dog eyes a fence it has not yet decided to respect. "You ain't even a voter." He cupped his hands to his mouth and called past Eli. "You gentlemen speak the Republic." Grey Hawk's face did not harden. It did not soften either. He slid his reins to his left hand and with his right made a small gesture in the air, as if showing someone the right-sized piece of meat to cut for a child. "We speak," he said in English. "We are speaking now." Galvin's eyes flicked to the shell at Tane's neck and then to the boy's shoes, and then to Eli's rifle on its pegs. "You give him food," he said, as if the question were a law. "I did." "You let him in your house?" "I did." Galvin looked like a man who had expected a fight and been handed his own reflection. He took it poorly. "Well, you can answer for it," he said. "Man sets himself up as agency. He can carry the paper." He spat, missing his own stirrup by a hand's width and making the horse sidestep. "Hear me, Mercer. They get hungry again, they come to you. You keep to your coffee pot. I got cattle 8 miles south, don't need to be jolted by a war whoop." "Maybe don't jolt first," Eli said before he could stop himself. Galvin opened his mouth to answer, but the older woman who had given Eli the bundle spoke over him. Soft, 3 syllables, then the same 3 again, and her voice worked on the air like a salve. Greyhawk tilted his head to catch it, then turned to Eli. "She says we will bring meat for your pot when we kill. She says you gave a fire, so we bring one back." From somewhere far along the line a drum started, 3 beats, as if to test the head, then a regular tapping like a heart that has decided to live after all. It wasn't show, it was signal, or maybe prayer. Eli could feel in his own bones the sound's intention. "We are here, we will not spill, we will behave ourselves and expect the same." Galvin snorted again and yanked his horse's head around in a motion that would have earned him a hoof in the face from a better animal. "I ain't paying for no parade," he muttered, and made the wise choice for once in his life. He left. His men followed, glad to be off the hook. The line breathed as one, a long, slow exhale. The drums ceased. Greyhawk pointed with his chin toward the cabin. "You will sit," he said. "You will drink with us." Eli would learn later how much was inside those 4 words. "You will receive us without fear. You will not resort to your own people when you feel small. You will not use the door as a weapon." For now, he only felt his legs go untrustworthy, and the coffee in his hand cold and forgotten, and the ridiculous fact that he was proud the cabin floor had been swept recently. They came 2 and 3 at a time, the way sensible people enter small spaces, and each one did the same thing, looked at Tane first, then at Eli, then at the stove. Each one said something with their face, and a few with words. The 2 older women took possession of the pot like old friends. The younger woman, with the 3 braids, fished 2 burned-on bits of soup from the rim with the back of a knife, and smiled at him for using everything up. A young man with a scar that made an unloved star on his chin laid a folded blanket on the table and patted it so that Eli would know it was his now. A boy just older than Tane handed him a leather thong braided neat as rope, which Eli understood to be a kind of handshake cast into an object. When the doorway held no more people without asking the wood to complain, Greyhawk spoke in his own language, and now and again in English for Eli's sake. "We are winter camp by the river," he said. 2 days, then we go to the agency to take flour. The word take was chosen carefully, not get, not ask. He, his chin indicated Tane, followed rabbits to this side. The snow made it hard to see the rabbits and easy to get lost. He slept by trees. He is foolish. He is fine. The older woman spoke, and her voice was honey poured over rough boards. "She says, you made her sister breathe again," Greyhawk translated, and his own throat seemed to agree with the words. "She says you put the fire back in the boy's blood. She says we bring a horse." "I don't need," Eli began, then stopped. He had learned the difference between refusing a kindness and protecting a man's pride. "That is more than I deserve," he corrected himself, because he could feel his own idiocy lined up like pews if he kept arguing. "I will use it to bring you things if you ask." Greyhawk's eyes warmed by a 1/4 inch. "We will ask," he said. "You will answer or you will not. That is how men do." A shadow crossed the door, someone taller than the lintel, someone who had to angle his head to come in. Eli looked up and found himself nearest the loosest place in his heart. The man had the look of a figure you'd see carved into a cliff, at rest and somehow still moving. His hair was streaked iron, and his eyes had that sideways brightness a man gets after years of checking a horizon. But what made Eli catch was not the face. It was the way the others made room without looking like they were making room. Respect can be loud. This was quiet. The tall man said something to Greyhawk and then to Eli in English that was so careful each word sat in its own chair. "I am Walks in Snow," he said. "I am brother of Tane's grandmother. I watched the ridge. I watched you open your hands." He made the opening gesture, and somehow in his fingers it included a lifetime. "I have seen men open hands and then close them very fast. I did not see that here." Eli didn't know what to do with the feeling in his chest, so he put it on his face and hoped it looked like gratitude. "I'm no saint," he said quietly. He looked at the boy. He was cold. Walks in Snow nodded as if that were the finest philosophy he'd ever heard. He slipped something out of the folded skin pouch on his belt and set it on the table. It was a pipehead carved from red stone, smooth as the inside of an old man's voice, and beside it, wrapped in cloth, a stem striped with porcupine quills in white and blue. "Not for you to keep," he said. "For us to show we came. We do not smoke inside your house. We do not blow ghosts at you. But we put it here," he tapped the table, "so the words are not alone." If Eli had been a different man, a Galvan or a man who counted blessings only when they lined up like paychecks, he would have flinched. He did not. He had learned in 100 small humiliations that there are certain moments when you must let someone else name the size of the world. He nodded. "Leave it there," he said. "I'll keep my mouth shut and my stove warm." There were formalities after. Gifts like arithmetic, questions like weather. Someone asked for coffee in the back-and-forth motion that is halfway between gesture and speech. The older woman served. Someone made the boy eat a cube of the dried meat while he was still in his uncle's lap, and everyone pretended not to watch how his eyes changed. Greyhawk made a quiet joke about the way Eli had put the coffee on the dried grounds already there, like a man trying to get a second run out of a horse. People smiled the way they do when they found a kind thing that is also not entirely smart, and they love it twice for each reason. When at last the cabin had held as much as it could of them and given back as much as possible without breaking, the line on the ridge thinned, and the first of the riders circled away toward the river. Tane did not want to go. He wanted, in the strange arithmetic of rescued boys, to be two places at once. He put his forehead to Eli's sleeve in a goodbye that was not a goodbye. Greyhawk lifted him to the saddle and then leaned over and touched Eli's shoulder. It was not the clap of a man slapping a friend. It was a weight, the kind that says, "You can call if you decide to." "We bring the horse tomorrow," he said. "There will be many. We will not ride at your door. We will wait." Eli almost laughed, looking at the long line of still slow riders. "I saw," he said. "You've already done a power of waiting." Greyhawk's teeth flashed. "Winter makes men patient," he said. "Sometimes. Sometimes it makes them stupid." He lifted his chin to the east. "You have a window that looks at the morning. This is better than a gun sometimes." When they had gone, when even the drumbeat had thinned into a story and the prints in the snow had laid themselves down like a silver fern, Eli went back into the cabin and sat. He put his palm flat on the table next to the red stone pipe and listened to the sound of his own blood and to the tiny tick at the heart of the stove. He had the oddest feeling that time had doubled up on itself like rope, and that he could feel, with his fingers, the place where two lengths had been spliced. He slept that night like a man who has been forgiven for something he had not known he was doing wrong. The morning broke cleaner. Whatever had made the snow breathe yesterday had moved on, leaving the sky like a scrubbed bowl. On the ridge, no line, only the long white flank of winter with rabbit signs on it. Eli kept the stove going because it pleased him to keep his word to someone who would only know by its absence if he broke it. He washed yesterday's tin cups in water heated on the stove and put them on the shelf upside down. He found himself sweeping the floor for the second time in as many days and laughed, thinking of himself as a man whose broom was leading him around by the hand. They came near noon. He heard them first. Not a tide this time, only the methodical beat of 6 horses and the chime of 2 brass rings on somebody's rig. He stood in the doorway before they were in sight, so they wouldn't have to puzzle out what to do with a closed door. 6 riders, 2 women and 4 men, and in the middle, led by a rawhide line, a bay mare with a black mane and a bright eye, winter fuzzy and sound as good wood. She was the kind of horse a practical man keeps and a vain man ignores, the best kind. Greyhawk was there, and the older woman, and a man Eli hadn't seen yesterday whose hairline had gone back away and left his face in permanent surprise. Tane was not there. Eli felt the boy's absence like the missing anchor point of a tent line on a windy night, and then reproached himself and smiled anyway, for what it meant. The child was with his people. They halted at a decent distance and sat, letting the silence go forward unafraid. Then the surprised-looking man dismounted and brought the mare up by her line, slow, making sure she knew the ground. He put the rawhide in Eli's hand, palm to palm, not in a throw, and stepped back to make the living thing between them obvious. "Her name," Greyhawk said, "is Willow Drink's Shadow." He seemed to wait to see if Eli would do the thing many men do when faced with a true name, make a joke, shave it down. Eli did not. He nodded. "I'll call her Willow," he said, "if she allows it." "She will allow it if you are not boring," the older woman said without translation, and then laughed at Eli's face. Willow blew into Eli's throat and went still to see what he would do. He did what he had seen horse-savvy men do since he could walk, put the back of his hand under her jaw, where the hair is fine and warm and the skin thin, and waited for her to decide. She decided in his favor, the way a horse decides anything, by selecting a world where this man exists. "She is for carrying," Greyhawk said. "She is for coming and going. She is not for trading. If you try, she will go hungry and follow the boy home." "I won't try," Eli said. Then, because it mattered to him to say it right, "Thank you. I know Thanksgiving is not a horse. I mean, I will keep her well." The surprised-looking man nodded once with beautiful seriousness, as if Eli had solved something for both of them. He reached into the blanket roll behind his saddle and handed Eli a small sack of dried cut grass. "Summer from our camp," he said, this time in English that made Greyhawk lift a brow and smile. "She knows this." Eli took the grass like he was receiving church and fed Willow 2 handfuls, then set the rest aside for later. He looked past the horse at Greyhawk. "Tell me what I owe," he said, "because even when you cannot repay a thing, you should let its price be spoken." Greyhawk squinted. "Oh," he said, tasting it, "you will bring coffee when you come. You will not be poor with your hands when a thing must be lifted. You will not let your people be stupid at the river." He shrugged, the movement that of a man unbuttoning a shirt after a hard day. "You will let the boy sleep by your fire if he gets lost again. He will. He is rabbit-minded sometimes." "That I can promise," Eli said. "Some of those things I can do even before you need them." He held the rawhide loosely in one hand and began, carefully, to curry Willow with long, firm strokes of his palm, the way you do when you don't have a brush, but you have time. The older woman watched him for a while, with eyes that were both approving and uncompromising. Then she glanced at Greyhawk and said something that made him laugh in the short way men laugh, who know one another's old stories. "She says," he translated, "if you are going to hang around here and teach our horse to be a cleaner person than some people, you may as well do something useful. We are going to the agency this afternoon. There will be flour if they are not lying. There will be trouble with a man who keeps the gate. We could use a man whose face is not my face to talk to a man who only hears his own." Eli remembered Galvin's voice and the pipe on his table, and the way the older woman had tapped the wood so the words would not be alone. "I can come," he said before his caution had time to put on its boots. Then, because he was learning to talk in whole truths, I want to come. They went along the creek and then crossed where the ice made a bridge with a hole in it for water to speak through, and then they descended into a shallow gully where the grass in summer would have been knee-deep, but now was a brown crown pressed by snow. The agency was a long house, with a shorter house attached to it, both built too thin for the wind and too proud for the fact. A wagon sat under a shed, like a dog put away for bad behavior. Two men stood at the door in coats that were not army and not ranch, a new kind of coat that had appeared all over the country lately, clothes for men whose hands do hard things with paper. Greyhawk reined in the party 30 paces off and sat, letting the men at the door imagine, adjust, settle their spines. Then he walked forward alone, and Eli with him, the older woman and the others staying back with Willow and the other horses, showing their willingness to be patient and their unwillingness to be foolish. The nearer man at the door had the face of someone who has once been handsome and now is an argument. "You speak for them?" he said to Eli, his eyes sliding over Greyhawk like a man glancing off good water. "I speak for me," Eli said. "I listen for them. If I say something stupid, he will tell me." He jerked his head a fraction toward Greyhawk. "We are here for the flour," Greyhawk said. "You received the notice. The last 2 wagons were light by 8 sacks. This time you will not make a mistake." The English sat clean in his mouth, as if it had been sanded. The man at the door looked past them at the group by the horses and then back and ran a thumb over the corner of his mouth. "We got deliveries," he said. "We got to account for those deliveries." Greyhawk let silence sit. Eli had learned this trick in 100 saloons, and once in a courtroom in Jefferson City. If you don't let a man fill his own silence, he'll show you what he's full of. The man at the door grew irritated with the quiet. "We got reports of stock off Mr. Galvin's southern pasture," he said. "Some of your young men got ideas." "The only stock off Galvin's pasture is his temper," Eli said, with a pleasantness he did not feel. "We're talking about flour. We're talking about everything," the man snapped, revealing his hand. "We can't open the shed without the agent. He's in town." Eli looked at the shed, then at the track into town, then at the sag of the roof. He looked at the second man, who had not spoken, and saw in him what he'd seen in himself too often, the wish to be done with nonsense. He also saw the glint of something not nonsense in the doorway, the edge of a ledger left out. He had been around enough freighting outfits to know what a shortage looks like. Never quite falls the same way twice, always falls in the direction of the same man's pocket. "The notice said noon," Greyhawk said. "We are at noon, and the agent's in town." "Then we will wait," Greyhawk said. "We are good at it." They did. It took 3 hours. Eli watched the men in the doorway get smaller without moving. He watched the older woman talk to 2 of the younger ones from the band, and then to a girl of 15, whose braid doubled back on itself like a question mark, and the way the young men stood when she spoke, and the girl laughed the way girls laugh when they have been witnessed. He watched Willow crop at a patch of grass revealed by a warm stone, and remembered the bag of summer hay in the cabin, and felt the oddest sensation that he could stay. When the agent came rolling up, new coat, new horse, mud on the cuffs, a set of not quite spoken words passed among the men at the door that might as well have been a telegram. Greyhawk lifted his chin and breathed once like a singer. The agent slid off his horse and performed with his mouth. He said welcome. He said gentlemen. He said in tones meant to be fatherly and landing closer to Weathervane that there had been a mix-up. He said the phrase supply chain, like a man proud of a ribbon. He took out a key and made a ceremony of crossing to the shed. He opened the door and then turned, a little too quickly, to block the view, which told Eli everything he needed to know. 8 short, Greyhawk said without looking. As last time. 6, the agent chirped. 8, the older woman said softly, and her voice made the syllable taste like a fact. The second man at the door could not bear the weight of the obvious. Just give them the damned sacks, he said without malice. Greyhawk looked at him and saw in his eyes a person he could do business with. The agent, seeing he was out of road, held up both hands like a child caught with sugar. "Fine," he said. "Fine. I'll send to Laramie for a correction." "No," Greyhawk said. "You will write now that there were 8 short and then 8 not short." Eli could have cried for the beauty of that sentence. It was law and mercy in one breath. They stood while the agent wrote, his pen biting the paper in a way he hoped sounded like justice. When he was done, Greyhawk read the words with the care of a man checking a horse's feet. He nodded. The younger men shouldered the sacks into the wagons one by one, with the particular grace hard work grants. Willow took her share of staring and was not bothered. The older woman turned to Eli at the very end and put her hand on his sleeve. "You are another piece on the table," she said in her own language. Greyhawk nodded, quick. "She means, when we lay a game out, we like to have many kinds of pieces. Today, you were a quiet piece. That is good." Eli bowed his head because he could not speak for a second without losing his own face. "I'd like to keep being that." "Good," Greyhawk said. "Tomorrow we go south. The snow will go hard in the morning and soft in the afternoon, and by the next day the river will have a new voice." He squinted toward the bending of the creek. "You will hear it if you are not busy being stupid." He looked at Eli. "Will you come when we call?" "When you call for coffee," Eli said, "or for a man to say a sentence in English to a fellow who won't listen to you because it would break his idea of himself, then yes. When you call to hunt, I will decline, because you don't need a fool scaring your rabbits. When you call for nothing at all, I may come anyway, because I don't like the sound of my own head." Greyhawk grinned. "We will call for all those and for none." They rode back in a light that had lost its tin and found a little brass in it. When they came to the cabin, willow in hand and the older woman humming something that might have been a work song or might have been a prayer that had given up pretending, Eli found himself stopping at the door and not going in, as if crossing that threshold now required a word he did not yet know. He turned to the ridge where yesterday's line had beaded itself and saw nothing but rabbit prints and a hawk making the lazy spirals of a creature that has done its worrying already and is still here anyway. "Stay," Greyhawk said, as if it were nothing, as if he were inviting a man to share a stump in a snowstorm. "Or go and come back. The river does not break when a man walks away from it." Eli laughed. "Funny you should say river," he said. "Seems to me the river is a better name for a man than any we dream up. Seems to me a man's life looks like water when you pay attention to it. It finds its bottom. It argues with the stone. It takes the shape of what holds it. It shines when the light helps." He touched Willow's jaw again and felt the horse's breath in his palm like a secret. "I've been run off for a while. I wouldn't mind learning to be a bend." The older woman made a pleased sound at the back of her throat. "He learns," she told the air. That evening, Eli tied Willow where she could see the door and not think she'd been hung out with the wash. And he cooked beans in the pot the correct way, with a good handful of salt and the little crock of fat the older woman had given him. And he put coffee on the grounds, without adding fresh, because it pleased him to do it wrong in this one small place, now that he was doing so many new things right. He ate with care and set aside 2 portions, one for morning, one for a boy who might or might not appear the next day. He cleaned the pipestone space on the table, though the pipe itself had gone, because a table remembers. He sat in the chair by the stove and picked up his rifle and looked at it, and then at the pegs where it could go. He held it a minute more, then put it up. He put his hand flat on the door, feeling the cold come through like the hand of a friend who had been working outdoors. He looked at the ridge where the world had once lined up and then come down. He thought about a woman in St. Joseph and a boarding house and furniture and heavy men. He thought of Galvin's horse sidestepping. He thought of flour and of a new coat with mud on it and of a sentence that made a ledger look back at itself. He thought of the way Greyhawk had tapped the table and put words there like nails that do not rust. When sleep came, it was not a trap, but a place to set your feet. In the morning, He saddled Willow with a care that included talking nonsense into her ear and telling her she was a better piece of the earth than any man he had met that week, and then he led her down to the creek where the ice was thin enough to scare him back into his senses. He did not cross. He cut 2 slabs of ice with the axe and carried them to melt for water, the work making his hands ring. At mid-morning he heard feet that were not horse. He turned and saw Tane standing 5 yards off, with his hands in his coat and his braids not quite even, a vision of misrule that would have made the older woman cluck and then smile. The boy looked at him and at the horse and at the door. "Coffee," Tane said solemnly, as if he had been charged with a holy errand. He stepped to the doorway and smelt the beans in the pot with reverence, then put his hand flat on the table as if he could feel something there. He turned, making serious eyes at Eli. "You?" He tapped his chest. "Fire good." Eli nodded, unable to say anything that would do better. He poured the coffee, half water, half coffee, the way a boy should have it, and they sat near the stove and drank. Tane put the cup down and stood and made the waiting gesture again, smoothing the air. Eli waited. From the ridge came, thin and pure as the shriek of a hawk's feather, the sound of one voice singing 2 notes and then another, and then the shapes of riders again. Not 250 this time, not a tide, just a handful. Enough to not be alone. They halted and waited. The boy stood and waited. Eli looked at his hands and decided that waiting was a craft he could get good at. When he stepped out, he lifted his empty palm and his other with the coffee cup in it, steam writing its tiny banner in the cold, and felt again that ridiculous, enormous pride in the fact of a swept floor and a bed with its blanket straight, in the sound of a horse outside who had chosen this door to stand near, in the little ledger on his table that tallied up a man's worth not in dollars, but in the way he opened his hands and whether he kept them open long enough to matter. He had not looked for a life at the edge of the Wind River. He had found one, or it had found him, which is really saying the same thing, and there was work to do that did not begin and end with his own appetite. When the riders were near enough to talk without hollering, he said the only thing there was to say, and he said it like he meant it, and like he would keep meaning it, in a winter that had decided not to kill him, and a country that had decided to teach him without lectures. "Come in," Eli Mercer said. "The fire's good."